Have you ever felt that no matter how much you drink, you still feel thirsty? That your skin feels incredibly dry, your mind is constantly sluggish, and your joints creak loudly as if they were made of old wood? Even though you are faithfully sticking to the famous rule of drinking 2 liters of water every single day. Well, what I'm going to tell you today goes against everything you know, everything we've been told up until now. Drinking water is not the same as hydrating. In fact, you could be drowning your cells in water and at the same time dying of thirst on a biological level. And it's easy to understand because the water that comes out of your tap and the one you buy in plastic bottles is technically water, dead. Yes, it's H2O but disorganized. And if your body were a cathedral, the water you're drinking right now is exactly like a flood in the basement. It's there, yes it is, but it doesn't help the cathedral's light shine or make the systems work. All it does is create dampness and chaos. And when I talk about dead water, I'm not saying that the molecule has ceased to exist, but rather that it has simply lost its coherence, its electrical charge, and its ability to structure itself. And to help you understand, in this sense, it's important to know the differences between bulk water or dead water and structured water or living water. What is meant by bulk water or dead water? It's simple. Stagnant water, water treated with chemicals or stored in plastic containers. Its molecules form gigantic and chaotic clusters. And for this water to enter your cells, your body has to spend a lot of its own energy. Thank you. ATP, which I've already talked to you about in other videos, is needed to break up those clusters and try to organize it. And on the other hand, what is meant by structured water or living water? It's water in motion, loaded with minerals and exposed to light. It's water that already comes in an H3O2 or hexagonal gel state. And it enters your cells without having to pay any kind of energy toll. Go figure. Why is that? Does plastic kill water? Well, you see, from a strictly technical engineering perspective, what I can do is provide a detailed explanation for you that plastic materials subject water to 3 distinct types of systemic environmental attacks. The first is charge dissipation. Spring water has a negative oxidation reduction potential, meaning it's full of electrons. However, plastic, which is an insulator and causes the water to stagnate, actually allows those electrons to dissipate. In other words, the water you drink from a bottle usually has a positive ORP. And what does this mean? Well, it means it's oxidizing. And instead of giving you energy, it takes it away from you. Second, electromagnetic vulnerability. Plastic does not protect the water from Wi-Fi frequencies or antennas, which end up breaking down the delicate hexagonal structure of living water. And third, chemical noise. Plastic bottles. Release. Microplastics and endocrine disruptors like bisphenols or phthalates, which act as noise in the electrical signal and prevent the formation of the exclusion zone, EZ, necessary for your cellular health. To put it simply, the water you drink reaches the basement of your cathedral, which is your stomach or intestine, but it has a surface tension so high that it can't rise up to the vaults, which are your cells and neurons. And that's why you feel heavy. But you still feel dry. So what recommendation can I give you from an engineering perspective? Well, glass will always be the guardian of structure. If you can choose, look for water in glass, but keep one thing in mind. Genuine and absolute sovereignty does not merely reside within the physical container, but most importantly and fundamentally, it is found in your inherent capacity to revive and renew yourself, that which has turned into bulk water or dead water. If you've seen my videos, you already know that 70% of your body is not liquid water, but rather an intelligent gel. And now, for a brief moment, let's take a step inside the scientific research laboratory of the man who successfully captured the first images of that fourth phase of water. And from there, I'm going to try to provide you with the detailed protocol you need to be able to revive, right in your very own kitchen, what is truly the essential and fundamental fluid of life. To truly understand the nature of hydration, you have to completely abandon the overly simplified and basic perspective of water, which sees it as merely a passive and inert solvent, and instead delve deeply into the complex scientific field of interstitial fluid dynamics. From a classical perspective of matter, water was understood to have, or to have had, three states. The first one, the solid state, ice. In this state, water molecules are joined together by hydrogen bonds in a fixed crystalline structure. And unlike most substances, water expands when it freezes. This makes it less dense in its solid state than in its liquid state. The second state is the liquid state, water, as we've always known it, and this is the most common state on Earth. The molecules have enough kinetic energy to constantly break and form bonds, which allows them to slide past one another. And this is what gives water its characteristic fluidity. And third, the gaseous state, that is vapor. When water reaches its boiling point or evaporates, the molecules gain so much energy that they completely separate and move at high speed, occupying all the available space in the air. That is vapor. But Professor and researcher Gerald Pollack, from the prestigious University of Washington, has conducted extensive research showing that water doesn't have just three simple states, but four. And we must also recognize that the fourth is the truly fundamental state of all biology. It is known as the complex hexagonal liquid crystal structure. What Pollack proposes is that between the liquid and solid states, there is a transitional phase. While regular water is H2O, this hexagonal liquid crystal has a different molecular structure, often described as H3O2. It mainly forms next to hydrophilic surfaces, that is, surfaces that attract water, such as the proteins in our cells. And I explained this to you in detail in my video, The Great Water Lie. Whenever liquid water comes into contact with a hydrophilic surface, such as for example collagen or cell membranes, what is scientifically known as a phase transition occurs. This process creates a unique structural change at the molecular level. The water molecules stop vibrating chaotically and self-organize into a two-dimensional network of hexagons. And this process, thank you, generates a critical physical phenomenon, charge separation. Let's analyze this in detail. The exclusion zone is that hexagonal network that attracts hydroxyl groups and actively excludes protons. And the result is a negatively charged zone which acts like a biological capacitor. But don't think I just threw that phrase out there for no reason. Now I'll explain in detail what I just told you. A capacitor is basically a common electronic component that stores electrical energy. It is not a battery that generates energy through a chemical reaction, but rather a simple device that stores an electrical charge by carefully separating it. To help you understand this better, in the case of water, just think of regular water, H2O. It's like a stable marriage, but on certain occasions, such as when water comes into contact with a biological surface, that is, a protein or a membrane, that marriage decides to reorganize itself. A hydroxyl group is a small part of that molecule. It's an oxygen atom bonded to a hydrogen atom. And here, as I was saying, the key is its electric charge. Why? Well, it's simple. because oxygen is truly addicted to electrons and attracts them very strongly. And by holding on to an extra electron in this sort of molecular dance, the group acquires a negative charge. And in the zone, in the exclusion zone, these OH negative pieces aren't just floating around at random. They organize themselves into perfect hexagonal sheets, like a honeycomb. And you might ask, what's the conclusion of all this? Well, it's very simple. Since they're negatively charged, that whole area becomes a kind of giant magnet. Thank you. For order and as a repellent for chaos. But let's pause for a moment to understand it better. When Pollack talks about a capacitor, as I mentioned before, he's referring to a device that stores energy by separating charges. A capacitor is basically two metal plates separated by an empty space, or by an insulating material. If you put electrons with their negative charge on one of the plates, the electrons attract positive charges to the other plate, and since they can't jump across the space that separates them, they simply stay there, tense, waiting for the moment to be able to flow. And that tension is the energy stored in the capacitor. Now you will clearly see what Professor Pollack actually proposes to us is that this specific process is exactly what happens inside each and every one of our biological cells. But of course, without metal plates. For him, the negatively charged plate is the so-called exclusion zone, which, being an extensive and complex network of hydroxyl groups, effectively carries a strong negative charge. The positive plate, thank you, is the regular water, which is where the protons expelled from the EZ accumulate, and the insulator is the very structure of the liquid crystal that keeps the protons out, preventing them from mixing and neutralizing the charge. Biophysically, this means that your cellular water is literally a battery with a measurable voltage. But if there is no exclusion, there is no potential difference, and without a potential difference, the biological cell is completely dead. And this is extremely significant and highly relevant to our understanding. Because if we truly accept the premise that cellular water functions as a capacitor, then the inevitable and logical next conclusion we must reach is that the entire human body not only consists of these elements, has the energy from eating. Think about it this way. A capacitor needs to be fully charged, and according to groundbreaking research from the University of Washington, this specific battery is charged with radiant energy, that is to say with light, and in particular with the invisible infrared light we receive from the sun and that we ourselves emit as heat energy. This process is quite fascinating when you consider how it works. This powerful radiant energy is what is responsible for significantly expanding the exclusion zone. And what does this mean? Well, it's very simple. Water is the transducer. It converts the electromagnetic energy from the environment into electrical energy, available for the cell. If the water in your cells isn't structured, that is, if there is no EZ, the capacitor is discharged. You can have all the oxygen and nutrients in the world, but if the cellular voltage drops, the machinery of life stops. That is to say, and it's very easy and important to understand, structure is authentic. Function. And all of this is a paradigm shift. We've gone from seeing the cell as a kind of sack of chemical reactions to seeing it as an electric motor that recharges with light and the order of water. Now let's go back for a moment to the structured gel. Chemically, this gel, I've already explained to you that it's not H2O. The ratio of atoms changes to H3O2, and it's a much denser, more viscous structure with an infinitely greater capacity for storing information. What Pollack discovered is that this exclusion zone acts as a true quantum filter due to its molecular density and its negative charge, and it expels any solid, from toxins and heavy metals to bacteria, and that's why we call it the exclusion zone. A cell hydrated with H3O2 is a cell that is physically impenetrable to disease. And you might ask me, how do I maintain this order in the face of the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy? Well, before I answer your question, let me remind you that entropy, in simple terms, basically stands for three things. First, the tendency toward chaos. In other words, it's much more likely for things to be disordered than ordered. It's very simple, radiant energy. You see, we usually think of light not just as something that lets us see, but in biophysics, light is pure energy in motion. And Pollack discovered that infrared light is the real thermodynamic work that builds the exclusion zone. Think of it this way. If you want to build a wall of perfectly aligned bricks, you need someone to move them and put them in place. And that physical effort is basically the work. In your cells, photons, which as you know are particles of light, are the workers that push water molecules so they stop being disordered and fit into that network. Hexagonal. Water is not indifferent to light. In fact, it is extremely selective. And although it absorbs energy in various parts of the spectrum, it has a critical absorption peak at 3000 nanometers. And what does this mean? Well, it means that this frequency falls within the near-infrared, which is NIR. It's the energy we perceive as radiant heat. It's as if water were radio tuned exactly to the frequency of 3000 nanometers. When that frequency arrives, the water resonates, absorbs the energy to the fullest, and uses that impulse. That pulse starts the transformation from ordinary water to liquid crystal. And the most impressive thing about Pollack's experiment is the magnitude of the change. This isn't a subtle improvement, it's a massive transformation. When water is exposed to this infrared light, the structured water layer not only remains, but as I mentioned, it expands, up to 10 times its original size. And this translates into something very simple. More light, more exclusion zone. More exclusion zone, a bigger battery. A bigger battery means more energy available for the cell. This fundamentally transforms the fundamental rules of the game. Because you see, it means that the size of your biological battery is not fixed. It depends directly on the radiant energy you receive. And that's why when we're in the sun or when we receive infrared heat, think of a fireplace. Not only do we experience a comforting sense of warmth, we also feel a profound sense of well-being. And that is because we are literally expanding the internal order within our cells and completely recharging our entire biological system. Now that we know that light is the worker that builds and expands this order, we can understand. Thank you. This is because entropy is its greatest and most persistent enemy. What entropy truly wants is for those diligent workers to simply go home and for the sturdy bricks to eventually crumble into dust. And this is exactly where the hexagonal liquid crystal seems like a true defiant rebel against the natural order. The law of entropy says that these water molecules should be moving. Thank you very much. These molecules are moving at random, constantly colliding with each other without any kind of fixed structure. And yet, Dr. Gerald Pollack shows that cellular water actually organizes itself into these massively ordered and highly complex structures. How is this possible without violating the laws of physics? The fundamental answer to this question is that biological cells are not actually isolated systems. In order to create internal order, or to put it in other words, to successfully achieve a state of low entropy, you must consistently perform biological work. It's like your room. It tends toward disorder on its own and only stays clean if you put in the energy to tidy it up. It's kind of like the energy housekeeping fee. Pollack discovered that the energy that pays for that order is light. Infrared. When these individual photons hit the surface of the water, they provide all of the necessary energy needed to effectively expel the disorder, which are the protons, and to slowly build up the complex hexagonal network structure. Light acts like a kind of cleaner. As the water becomes crystalline and ordered, within the exclusion zone, what it does is push the chaos outward into the regular water, or what is known as bulk water. It's a kind of deal with the universe. It lets you create an oasis of order inside your cell as long as what you do is increase the disorder outside. This is something like local order in exchange for global disorder. And why is this vital for you? If entropy wins inside your cell, the structure of the water disappears. The complex proteins begin to unfold. Electrical charges start to mix together. And that internal battery I was talking about eventually becomes completely depleted. In biology, total thermodynamic equilibrium is synonymous with death. And being alive is literally the act of fighting against entropy every second. And the tools we have are to use light to keep water structured. That's why I think what we need to do is try to change our mindset. Because what we're looking for isn't simply to drink liquid. What we're looking for is to maintain a gradient, an electric one. Real hydration isn't about flooding the system, it's basically about building and protecting a network of liquid crystals that's capable of holding a negative charge in the face of the constant oxidation from the environment around us. And now that we understand that hydration is a matter of electricity and thermodynamics, we have to face the practical challenge. None of the topics we have discussed will matter much if the material you introduce into the system is found to be defective, flawed, or broken. As I mentioned before, water that travels through pipes at high pressure, crashing into 90-degree angles, or that simply sits stagnant in plastic bottles, is water in a completely dead thermodynamic equilibrium. Physically speaking, the state is entirely chaotic, and its internal molecules are not arranged in a way that forms organized networks. Instead, they are simply piled up together in disordered macrostructures of atoms, which are commonly referred to as clusters or aggregates. Because of this lack of structure, these biological cells have to use a huge amount of energy. An enormous amount of ATP, that is chemical energy, to try to break up these clusters so that the water can be filtered and used. It is a totally ridiculous waste of money. And that is exactly why we are going to learn how to bring the fluid back to life and restore its movement by mimicking and replicating the energy of nature itself, along with the complex mechanical dynamics found within a coiled spring. We're going to restore water's ability to carry life through 3 biological engineering processes that you can do at home, and that are very simple. The first is the vortex, or the kinetic spark. And all of this comes from why a river cleans itself, so you can understand. Well, it's very simple, because of the helical movement. Tap water is a stressed fluid. The pressure it carries and the confinement in those pipes completely destroy its natural structure. So what you need to do first is put the water in a glass jug and stir it for 30 seconds with a wooden spoon until you create a deep funnel in the container. And in this way, you will be generating what are called shear forces. This is pure physics, and what these forces do is break up those large clusters of H2O, reducing surface tension and increasing the energy density at the center of the vortex. So it's simply a process of implosion. In other words, what you're doing is preparing the ground for what comes next, to carry out the nucleation of the liquid crystal. Second step, mineralization, which means giving it ionic charge. Distilled water, or water with very weak mineralization, is, biophysically, basically an insulator, because without ions, there is no battery. And what should we do to solve this problem? Very simple. Add approximately 1.5 to 2 grams of Celtic salt or Brittany salt per 1.5 liters of water. What this does is it hides a biophysical function, because minerals are not just for nutrition. They also act as nucleation sites. In other words, they serve as ionic anchors around which water molecules organize themselves into hexagonal layers. If you don't have these ions, the exclusion zone network has no support and collapses. What you're achieving by adding this salt is turning an inert liquid into a living electrolyte that mimics your own plasma. But pay attention, because there's one more step left. The third step, photomodulation, or rather, put another way, charging the battery. And this is the final step that most people overlook. As Pollack demonstrated, and as I've told you before, structured water eats light. Well, after the previous two steps, you need to expose the glass jar to sunlight or to a source of near-infrared light. And you should do this for at least 15 to 30 minutes. This, so you understand, is like giving the water the fuel it needs. Photons in the 3000 nanometer spectrum provide the energy needed for the EZ to physically expand. And by doing this, what you're basically achieving is pre-charging the water before it comes into contact with your membranes. Or in other words, you save your body the metabolic work of having to structure it. But there's one last thing, and for many people this isn't so easy or simple to do. And here's the easy tip, so to speak. If you live in the city and don't have time to dance with a pitcher, which is the case for many of us, then you should proceed to apply something that we might typically refer to as a modern form of convenience-based technology. Use a blender for 10 seconds. The centrifugal movement is a true instant reset for molecular clusters. If you don't have sunlight, use a red therapy light or an infrared lamp and place it in front of the pitcher during breakfast so that they inject the necessary radiant energy. And if you do not happen to have any glass pitchers or a blender or even an infrared lamp, you might want to consider searching for traditional containers made of solid copper. Copper acts as an essential mineral catalyst that helps to organize and stabilize the internal structure in a passive way, and it does so specifically through the process of resonance. Well, this brings us to a final conclusion that I find particularly interesting. It turns out that there is much more to consider here. You could live without doing this protocol. In fact, you've been doing it for years and probably never missed it. So why? Why complicate my life? I'm sure you're wondering that. Well, there's a fundamental reason that I think is important for you to know. It's very simple: to save you energy, and also a lot of energy that takes you a lot of effort to produce, even if you might not realize it. And I'm going to explain it to you in a bit more detail. Aquaporins, that is, the pores in your cells, are so narrow that molecules have to pass through one by one. With dead water, the cell spends an enormous amount of ATP energy untangling the bundles so they can fit, so they can get in. And with revitalized water, since it is already structured and has much lower surface tension, the water slides through the aquaporins without resistance. In other words, by applying this protocol, you are giving your system something like 20% extra energy that until now you have been wasting just in the metabolic process of hydrating yourself when you drink water. That is, you could stop being just a water consumer and become a true engineer of your own voltage. And think about what that extra 20% could mean in your life. But of course, as it should be, the decision is yours. I'm just trying to help you with information. And now let's recap to finish up. Today, we've done much more than just talk about drinking water. We've redesigned the electrical infrastructure of your life. We've gone from the basic chemistry of a liquid, an inert one, to the biophysics of a liquid crystal. From now on, I'm sure that when you look at a glass of water, you won't just see a hydrator, you'll see a medium for energy transmission. You have now fully recognized and confirmed that your physical body is not just a simple container, but a true H3O2 battery that constantly charges with physical movement, essential minerals, and natural sunlight. And you are no longer a helpless victim of biological thirst or stagnant, lifeless dead water. Now you hold in your hands the sovereignty to revive the master fluid, and you can do it right in your own kitchen. You have the roadmap to transform your insides from a disorganized puddle into a radiant crystal that beats at -70 millivolts. But remember, the structure of your cathedral is probably ready now, but a water crystal needs a constant connection to the source so it doesn't fall apart. Revived water is undoubtedly the fuel, but we need your cells to have the capacity to sustain that charge. In the next episode, I will dive fully into the biological pharmacopoeia. I will give you the map of the 6 families of foods that act as sensors, shields, and light antennas. And we will see how, for example, pears tune your neurons, how kiwi preserves your metabolic water, and how fats, thank you, seal your membranes so that energy doesn't escape anymore. Well, if this journey into your own biology is helping you regain your energy and you think this content could be useful to others, you would be doing me a great favor by sharing it. There are many people out there drinking water while inside. They are withering away, and you can be the link that reconnects them to their own sovereignty over their health. You already know what I always tell you. Go forward, always forward, and I'll read your comments.